In this video lesson, we'll discuss women and their role in the city, as well as the reform movements of the time period. The urban environment was hard on families. Crowded cities were emotionally isolating. As families increasingly became the arena for intimate companionship and for emotional and psychological satisfaction, they were subjected to stress. The urban era launched the era of divorce as well. And you could see in this chart a representation of the numbers of marriages and divorces from 1890 all the way to 2008. Not only fathers, but mothers and even children as young as 10 years old often had to work, usually in widely scattered locations. Children were more as baggage in the city. Not surprisingly, birth rates were still dropping, and family size continued to shrink. Marriages were being delayed, and more couples learned the techniques of birth control. The decline in the family size, in fact, affected rural Americans as well. Women were growing more independent in the urban environment, and in 1898 they heard the voice of a major feminist prophet, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Publishing Women and Economics, a classic feminist literature, Gilman displayed the restless temperament and reforming zeal characteristic of the remarkable Beecher clan. She devoted herself to a vigorous regimen of physical exercise and meditation. Gilman called on women to abandon their dependent status and contribute to the larger life of the community through the productive involvement in the economy. She argued that our highly specialized motherhood is not so advantageous as believed. She also advocated centralized nurseries and cooperative kitchens to facilitate women's participation in the workforce. This was in anticipation of daycare centers. Fiery feminists also continued to insist on the ballot. They had been demanding the vote since before the Civil War, but many high-minded female reformers had temporarily shelved the cause of women to battle for the rights of African Americans. In 1890, militant suffragists formed the National American Women's Suffrage Movement. Its founder, including aging pioneers like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had helped organize the first Women's Rights Convention in 1848, and her longtime comrade, Susan B. Anthony, the radical Quaker Spitfire who had courted jail. By 1900, a new generation of women had taken command of the suffrage battle. Their most effective leader was Carrie Chapman Catt, a pragmatic and dedicated reformer. Under Catt, the suffragists de-emphasized the argument that women deserved the vote as a right, because they were in all respects equals of men. Instead, Catt stressed the desirability of giving women the vote if they were to continue to discharge their traditional duties as homemakers and mothers in the public world of the city. In the city, they needed a voice on boards of public health, commissions, school boards, and they linked the ballot to a traditional definition of a woman's role. Suffragists registered encouraging gains as the new century opened. Women were increasingly permitted to vote in local elections, especially on school issues. Wyoming Territory, called the Equality State, gained the first unrestricted or granted the first unrestricted suffrage to women in 1869, and many states followed Wyoming's example. Most of the states by 1890 had passed laws to permit wives to win or control their property after marriage. City life fostered the growth of women's organizations, but the reborn suffrage movement and other women's organizations excluded African American women from their ranks. Fearful that an integrated campaign would compromise its efforts to get the vote, the National American Women's Suffrage Association limited membership to whites. African American women created their own associations. Ida B. Wells inspired African American women to mount a nationwide anti-lynching crusade. She helped launch the African American Women's Club movement, which culminated in the National Association of Colored Women in 1896. Alarming gains by Demon Rum spurred the Temperance Reforms to redoubled zeal. The corner saloon, known as the Poor Man's Club, helped keep his family poor. Liquor consumption had increased during the nerve-wracking days of the Civil War, and immigrant groups accustomed to alcohol in the old country were hostile to restraints. Many tippers charged that temperance reform amounted to a middle-class assault on working-class lifestyles. The National Prohibition Party, organized in 1869, polled a sprinkling of votes in some of the ensuing presidential elections with catchy songs of sober souls. Militant women entered the alcoholic arena, notably when the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, was organized in 1874, using the white ribbon as their symbol of purity. The saintly Frances E. Willard, a champion of Planned Parenthood, was leading its spirit, but less saintly was a muscular, mentally deranged Carrie A. Nation. She boldly smashed saloon bottles and bars with her hatchet and brought considerable disrepute to the Prohibition movement because of the violence of her one-woman crusade. The potent AntiSaloon League was formed in 1893. Statewide prohibition, which had made surprising gains in Maine and elsewhere before the Civil War, began sweeping the country. The great triumph came in 1919 when the National Prohibition Amendment was attached to the Constitution as the 18th Amendment, but it was only a temporary victory. Banners of other social crusaders were aloft as well. The American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals was created in 1866. The American Red Cross was launched in 1881 with Clara Barton, the angel of the Civil War battlefields, at the helm. Portrait painting continued to appeal, but many of America's finest painters made their living abroad in Europe. James Whistler did much of his work and that of his mother in England. Another gifted portrait painter in self-exile in England was John Singer Sargent. Mary Cassatt, an American in exile in Paris, painted sensitive portrayals of women and children that earned her a place in the pantheon of French Impressionist painters. Other brush wielders, no less talented, brightened the artistic horizon. George Inness became America's leading landscapist. Thomas Eakins attained a high degree of realism in his paintings, a quality not appreciated by portrait sitters. Winslow Homer was perhaps the greatest painter of the group. He revealed rugged realism and boldness of conception. His canvases of the sea and of fisherfolk were masterly, and probably no American artist has excelled him in portraying the ocean. Probably the most gifted sculptor yet produced by America was Augustus St. Gaudens. Among his most moving works is the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial in Boston. Music was gaining popularity, and America in the 1880s and 1890s was assembling high-quality symphony orchestras, notably in Boston and in Chicago. Strains of homegrown American music were sprouting in the South. African-American folk traditions like spirituals and ragged music were evolving into the blues, ragtime, and jazz. A marvelous discovery was the reproduction of music by mechanical means. The phonograph, invented by the deaf Edison, had by 1900 reached over $150,000 homes. This is the Robert Gould Shaw's monument that is in Boston, previously discussed in this slide. In addition to skyscraper builder Louis Sullivan, a famous American architect of the age was Henry H. Richardson, who spread his influence throughout the eastern half of America. He popularized a distinctive ornamental style that came to be known as Richardsonian. High vaulted arches were his trademark, and his masterpiece and most famous work was the Marshall Field Building in Chicago. A revival of classic architectural forms and a setback for realism came with the Great Columbian Expedition. Held in Chicago in 1893, it raised American artistic standards, promoted city planning, and was visited by more than 27 million people. The pursuit of happiness by century's end had become a frenzied scramble. People sought their pleasures fiercely, as they had overrun their continent fiercely. And they had the time, basically, to have amusement. Americans inconsistently sought to escape from democratic equality. Vaudeville, with its coarse jokes and graceful acrobats, continued to be immensely popular during the 1880s and 1890s, as were minstrel shows in the South. The circus finally emerged full-blown. Phineas Barnum, the master showman, joined hands with James A. Bailey in 1881 to present the greatest show on earth. Colorful Wild West shows, first performed in 1883, were even more distinctively American. Headed by William F. Buffalo Bill Cody, the troupe included war-whooping Native Americans, live buffalo, and dead-eye marksmen. Among them was Annie Oakley. Baseball was clearly emerging as the national pastime, and a league of professional players was formed in the 1870s and 1880s as an all-star baseball team toured the world. A gladiatorial trend towards spectator sports was exemplified by football as well. This rugged game had become popular well before 1889, when Walter Camp chose his All-Americans. A scientific boxer wrestled the world championship from the again alcoholic John L. Sullivan when boxing became a part of the business of amusement. Two crazes swept the country in the closing decades of the century. Croquet became all the rage but it was condemned by moralists of the naughty 90s because women were exposing their legs. The low-framed safety bicycle came to replace the high-seated model, and in 1893 1 million bicycles were in use, and thousands of young women were turning to this new spinning wheel, one that offered freedom, not tedium. Basketball was invented in 1891 by James Naismith, a YMCA instructor. Designed as an active indoor sport that could be played during winter months, it spread rapidly. The land of the skyscraper was plainly becoming more standardized as well. Owing largely to the new industrialization, Americans started to share a common popular culture. And we'll continue to investigate the birth of the popular culture and the impact on the American lifestyle in our lesson in class.